There's a moment buried inside an old episode of Father Knows Best that most people missed. At first glance, it looks like any other scene. A calm father giving advice at the kitchen table, surrounded by his smiling family. But if you look closer, you'll see something unsettling. Robert Young's hands were trembling. His eyes lost focus for just a second, and his words came out slower than usual. It wasn't a performance choice. It wasn't acting at all. The editors noticed it, but reshooting that one scene would have cost $25,000. So, they left it in. What the audience didn't know was that behind that steady, comforting face of America's dad, Robert Young was fighting a private battle he was too ashamed to reveal. Decades later, his wife finally admitted what was really happening during filming. And it wasn't just one bad day. The truth was that he'd been struggling almost every episode, hiding his depression and alcoholism behind that famous fatherly smile. The moment that slipped through wasn't just a blooper. It was a glimpse into a real man breaking down in plain sight. For 6 years, America thought it was watching the perfect family, the Andersons, living their clean, picture-perfect suburban life. But behind those black-and-white walls was a story much darker than anyone imagined. To understand how such a comforting illusion could form, you have to go back to the late 1940s, when it all began not on TV, but on the radio. In August 1949, a new show called Father Knows Best made its debut. At the time, the airwaves were crowded with family comedies, nearly 20 different programs, all competing to be the nation's favorite. But somehow, this quiet little series stood out. It wasn't built on wild punchlines or chaos. It was about gentle lessons, kind words, and ordinary people. Within a few years, it became one of the most successful family shows on radio, airing for 5 full years and producing nearly 200 episodes. Creator Ed James wrote more than half of them himself. Sponsors like Maxwell House Coffee and General Foods stayed loyal, even as television began stealing radio's audience. In 1951, the show reached a 13.4 rating, one of the highest that year, and it wasn't just American families tuning in. The series was broadcast across 39 Canadian stations too. Without realizing it, Father Knows Best was quietly building the foundation for something far bigger than a radio hit. It was creating the blueprint for the perfect family image that television would soon sell to an entire generation. By 1953, television had officially taken over, and Robert Young, who played Jim Anderson on radio, refused to let the show die quietly. Along with producer Eugene B. Rodney, he created a production company called Rodney Young Productions. The two men risked everything to bring the show to television. They invested $40,000 just to build the Anderson family's house on Stage 11 at Columbia Pictures. A full-scale home with real walls, a functioning kitchen, and enough space for cameras to move smoothly through scenes. Each episode cost $25,000 to shoot on high-quality 35mm black-and-white film, which was expensive for the time. Still, they stayed ahead of schedule, often completing 17 episodes before the first one even aired. It was a massive logistical operation, but it worked. Over the next 11 years, Robert Young and Eugene Rodney produced more than 200 episodes, defining what an American family was supposed to look like. But the most important transformation happened inside the show's main character. On the radio version, Jim Anderson wasn't the patient, loving father audiences remember. He was sarcastic, short-tempered, and sometimes downright mean. He called his kids stupid. He snapped at his wife. It was the standard comedic style of the day, funny in a cynical way, but when the series moved to TV in 1954, that tone had to change. The producers made Jim Anderson gentle, wise, and endlessly calm. Critics said he was the first intelligent father ever shown on television. This wasn't an accident. After World War II, America wanted reassurance. People wanted to see strong, moral fathers who knew right from wrong, who led their families with love instead of anger. The new Jim Anderson became the national ideal, the version of fatherhood people wished they had. And Robert Young, for better or worse, became the living embodiment of that illusion. The women behind Father Knows Best had their own quiet stories. Before Jane Wyatt became America's favorite TV mom, the role of Margaret Anderson had been voiced on the radio by Jean Vander Pyle, a name few people recognize, even though almost everyone knows her voice. Years later, she would become the voice of Wilma Flintstone. She earned just $250 per episode back then, and even when she landed the Flintstones, she made only $15,000 total for all of Wilma's episodes. Her voice helped define two generations of American mothers, yet her name was barely known. Jane Wyatt, who eventually brought the character to television, had an even more complicated past. Before joining the show, she had been blacklisted during the early 1950s for protesting the government's anti-communist witch hunts. In 1947, she had flown to Washington alongside Humphrey Bogart and other stars to defend free speech and protest Hollywood's fear-driven loyalty oaths. Studios retaliated by refusing to hire her. Sometimes she was offered roles only to have them pulled away days later. Even speaking out against Hitler before America entered World War II had gotten her labeled prematurely anti-fascist. Her career was nearly destroyed. Father Knows Best wasn't just another job. It saved her from permanent exile in Hollywood. Ironically, playing the gentle, apolitical mother of the Anderson family brought her back into America's good graces. Just a few months before the show officially launched, CBS tested a pilot called Keep It in the Family. It featured Robert Young, but an entirely different cast, and it failed miserably. The chemistry was off, the tone felt forced, and the warmth simply wasn't there. Eugene Rodney knew the show wouldn't work unless the cast truly felt like a real family. So, he started over completely. More than 30 boys auditioned for the role of Bud Anderson. The part went to Billy Gray, not because he was the funniest, but because he was the most natural. When he was asked to deliver a line about a girl stealing money for a television, every other boy tried to play it for laughs. Billy didn't. He said it straight. And that honesty made him perfect for the role. For the youngest daughter, Kathy, 78 girls auditioned. The one who got it, 8-year-old Lauren Chapin, had no acting experience at all. And that was exactly what producers wanted. Her innocent energy made her believable as the family's little kitten. But behind that bright smile, Lauren was living through something unthinkable. Off-screen, her childhood was a nightmare. Her mother was an alcoholic who could barely function, and her father began sexually abusing her when she was only 2 years old. The abuse continued, even while she was filming the show. Lauren later said she had no idea what a real family was supposed to be like until she started reading the Father Knows Best scripts. She learned from fiction what love and safety were supposed to look like. On set, she worked 16-hour days, rehearsing on Mondays and Tuesdays, filming from Wednesday to Friday, and extra sessions on Saturdays when needed. She studied with a tutor in a tent between scenes, barely given time to rest. To America, she was the perfect daughter. In reality, she was a child surviving abuse, exhaustion, and fear. Across from her on set was Robert Young, the man playing her calm, wise father. He was kind to her, professional, and patient. But he, too, was carrying his own pain. Robert had been drinking heavily since the 1940s, long before the show started. What began as a few drinks to ease his anxiety turned into a full addiction. During the filming of Father Knows Best, he was often drinking before arriving on set. Sometimes he was fine. Sometimes he wasn't. His wife, Betty, spent years trying to cover up the evidence, helping him home when he stumbled, keeping his reputation intact. No one wanted to believe that the man playing America's perfect father was, in truth, a broken man trying to hold himself together. The Anderson family kitchen, where so many heartfelt moments were filmed, cost $40,000 to build. It wasn't just a set. The appliances worked, the cabinets opened, and the actors actually used the space like a real home. They made coffee there in the mornings, shared pastries, stored their lunches in the fridge. Director Peter Tewksbury was meticulous about detail. He'd make the cast rehearse how to spread butter on toast or fold a napkin until it looked effortlessly natural. That authenticity fooled the nation. Viewers believed every frame, believing they were witnessing a real family sharing genuine affection. But the truth was far more tragic. The warmth on screen was an illusion built by perfect lighting, flawless scripts, and actors whose real lives were falling apart. On screen, the world was in black and white. Off screen, it was much darker than anyone could have imagined. By the time Father Knows Best ended its original run in 1962, the illusion of the Anderson family had become deeply embedded in American culture. People genuinely believed in Jim Anderson, the calm, moral, endlessly patient father. And by extension, they believed in Robert Young. Viewers trusted him. They saw him as the man who always had the right words, the right advice, the steady voice of reason in a chaotic world. But behind the curtain, the man himself was crumbling. His drinking had worsened over the years, and the depression that haunted him since the 1940s was now unshakable. His wife Betty had lived through countless nights of worry, trying to keep his public image clean while privately watching the man she loved disappear into guilt and alcohol. Robert often said he felt trapped inside the role that made him famous. To millions, he was the father who had it all figured out. But when the cameras stopped, he was a man who could barely hold himself together. Lauren Chapin was just 17 when the series ended, and the fantasy life she had lived on set vanished overnight. The little girl America had known as Kitten Anderson suddenly had nowhere to go, no future, and no sense of self. Hollywood didn't want her anymore. She was too closely tied to her childhood role. Casting directors couldn't see past the perfect daughter they'd grown up with. When the paychecks stopped coming, her own mother, the same woman who had allowed years of abuse, sued her for the money she had earned as a child. It was a cruel, almost absurd betrayal. At just 18, Lauren's real life was collapsing faster than she could understand. She began using marijuana and drinking, trying to numb the pain she'd carried since childhood. Soon after, it escalated into heroin addiction. The downward spiral was fast and brutal. In 1967, she was arrested in Los Angeles for check fraud, the first of many run-ins with the law. She bounced between jail cells and psychiatric hospitals for nearly 3 years. The bright, cheerful girl who once smiled in every American living room had been completely broken by a world that only cared about her as a symbol. Her story only got darker. During her addiction, she became trapped in an abusive relationship with a heroin dealer who forced her into prostitution to pay for drugs. At her lowest point, she was so desperate to end her pain that she tried to cut off her own left hand with a meat cleaver. She survived, but the physical and emotional scars never healed completely. Her body began to give out. She contracted viral encephalitis and hepatitis, diseases that nearly killed her. For 6 months, She lay bedridden, barely alive, before she finally began to recover. That near-death experience changed her. In 1979, Lauren walked into Eagle's Nest Church in Los Angeles and decided to change her life forever. She found faith, sobriety, and purpose. She later became a childbirth teacher, worked in AIDS outreach, and started a small ministry dedicated to helping others find hope after trauma. Somehow, the same girl who grew up acting out a fake version of love had finally found the real thing. While Lauren was fighting for her life, Robert Young's struggle continued into his old age. In 1966, just a few years after the show ended, he was arrested for drunk driving. The arrest made headlines, and, for the first time, the public saw cracks in the perfect image of America's dad. The man who once symbolized stability and virtue was now seen stumbling, confused, and broken. His wife Betty continued to support him, but the burden was heavy. Robert tried everything: therapy, Alcoholics Anonymous, medication, but nothing seemed to last. The guilt of living a double life wore him down. He once said he hated the irony of being known as the man who gave everyone else advice, while secretly being unable to save himself. The depression became unbearable. Then, one January morning in 1991, Robert reached his breaking point. At 83 years old, in his home in Westlake Village, he decided to end his life. He ran a hose from his car's exhaust into the passenger seat and tried to poison himself with carbon monoxide. But fate intervened in an odd way. The car wouldn't start. Frustrated and still drunk, Robert called for a tow truck. When the driver arrived, he noticed the hose running into the car and immediately understood what was happening. He refused to turn the engine on and called the police. When officers arrived at 8:14 a.m., they found Robert sitting in the car, intoxicated and crying. He told them plainly that he wanted to die. His wife Betty was also drunk and could barely speak. She told police that Robert had asked her to join him in a suicide pact, but she hadn't taken it seriously. That near-tragic morning became the turning point of his life. Robert checked himself into a psychiatric hospital for intensive care, and for the first time, he didn't hide his pain. He began talking openly about his depression and addiction, using his fame to bring awareness to mental health, something very few actors of his generation had ever done. He became an advocate, helping establish the Robert Young Community Mental Health Center in Santa Barbara, dedicated to providing care for those who suffered silently as he once had. It was his final act of redemption. The man who had pretended to save others on television spent his last years trying to save real people. Meanwhile, the show's perfect son, Billy Gray, faced his own fall from grace. In 1962, not long after the series ended, Billy was driving in Los Angeles when a police officer pulled him over. The moment the window rolled down, the officer smelled marijuana. A search of the car turned up a small bag under the seat, just a few seeds and stems. It was barely enough to call a crime, but in 1962, it was enough to destroy a career. Billy didn't deny it. He entered a plea of nolo contendere, not admitting guilt, but not fighting the charge either. The punishment was extreme. He was sentenced to anywhere between 1 and 10 years in prison. In the end, he served 45 days on a California prison farm, but those 45 days changed everything. The first week, he was punched in the face by another inmate simply for being a former child star. The real punishment, though, came when he was released. His agency, MCA, one of the biggest in Hollywood, dropped him immediately. They told him bluntly that they could no longer represent him. Overnight, The boy America had known as the wholesome Bud Anderson was branded a drug addict, even though his only crime was a handful of seeds. He became a cautionary tale. The same press that once celebrated his clean-cut image now labeled him a disgrace. Ironically, just over a decade earlier, another Hollywood actor, Robert Mitchum, had been arrested for the exact same thing. Mitchum's arrest made him seem rebellious and cool, almost romanticized. Billy Gray's arrest, however, destroyed him. Two men, same offense, completely different outcomes. For years afterward, Billy struggled to find work. In 1971, his name surfaced again, this time because of a mistake that would haunt him for nearly 3 decades. Film critic Leonard Maltin wrote a short blurb about a movie called Dusty and Sweets McGee, claiming that one of the real-life drug addicts in the film was Billy Gray. But Billy wasn't a drug addict. He was acting. Still, the note stayed in every edition of Maltin's movie guide from 1974 until 1998. For 27 years, directors and producers assumed Billy Gray was a real addict, not an actor. In 1997, he finally filed a libel lawsuit. The following year, Leonard Maltin publicly apologized at a press conference, admitting the mistake. But by then, the damage had already been done. Even as the actors' real lives unraveled, Father Knows Best continued to air in reruns throughout the 1960s and 70s. People still watched the Andersons sit around their kitchen table, solving problems in 30 minutes, unaware that the real people behind those smiles were barely surviving. The laughter audiences heard during the show wasn't from a live studio audience. It came from a device known as the Laugh Box, a machine built by sound engineer Charles Douglas. Inside it were hundreds of recorded chuckles, giggles, and bursts of laughter, each one labeled and played back by hand. The box was locked with padlocks, so no one could steal its contents. The producers treated it like gold. Eugene Rodney, one of the show's creators, reportedly cried while mixing in the laughter. To him, it sounded so genuine, so alive, but it wasn't. The laughter, like everything else on that set, was manufactured. It was one more layer of illusion. The Anderson house itself, the famous living room, the neat garage, the bright kitchen with red wallpaper and white cabinets, was designed to look like a dream. It was real enough that the cast treated it like home. They drank coffee there, swapped jokes, even stored lunches in the fridge. Everything felt authentic, because that was the point, to make families watching at home believe in an image of life that didn't exist. The writers of the show, Ed James, Roswell Rogers, Paul West, and Dorothy Cooper, collectively crafted hundreds of episodes filled with moral lessons, soft humor, and tidy endings. Each episode was like a half-hour sermon about what family should be. But the people delivering those sermons were carrying the kinds of pain they could never have written into the script. By the 1990s, America began to look back at shows like Father Knows Best with fresh eyes. Historian Stephanie Kuntz published a groundbreaking book called The Way We Never Were in 1992, exposing the myth of the perfect family. She pointed out that the 1950s weren't nearly as innocent as television had made them seem. Teenage pregnancy rates were higher than ever. Marriages were failing, and social pressures were immense. Families weren't broken. They were just real, messy, human. The Andersons were never a reflection of reality. They were a reflection of what people wished reality could be. And maybe that's why Father Knows Best still matters today. It wasn't about a real family. It was about hope. It gave people something to believe in during uncertain times.